This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Now, you know, on this podcast, I like to go down all kinds of paths. Now, usually they're all interconnected and related. Sometimes you might say to yourself, Mike, I disagree. That's not true. Well, I really don't care. I'm the person that programs this damn podcast, and I know it's true. Now, if you're out there and maybe you've read one of my books over the years, maybe you're going down the path of trying to make a lot of money, and that's a great thing. But once you get that bag of money, then what? You got the rest of your life figured out? You got the relationship stuff figured out? Most of us don't. Most of us make a lot of mistakes. My guest today, two therapists, have some fantastic insights on navigating relationships. John Kim, Vanessa Bennett. Their book, It's Not Me, It's You. Break the blame cycle, relationship better. Sometimes in life, we can make things more complicated. And then when you get behind the scenes, you find out there was actually an easier way. I give John and Vanessa great props because given, and we all know this, given the complexity of relationships, not having a toolkit to navigate, hey, that might be the end of the relationship. That might be a divorce. Or maybe you learn you never should have been with that person. So I can promise you, all of you business people, all of you academics, all of you traders, all of you investors, and for the people that listen to this show because they just love all these psychology guests that come on, I can guarantee you that John and Vanessa bring a perspective to relationships where you will have your aha moment. Without any further delay from me, let's jump right in with John Kim and Vanessa Bennett. I hope you enjoy. Here's my opening salvo question, John. The American Nightmare. I could think of George Carlin. I could think of his comic routine on The American Dream. But you see relationships. I mean, of course, there's good and bad relationships. There's positive, there's negative, there's success, there's failure. But right now, the American Nightmare, where did that come from?
The American Nightmare came from working with clients and them having anxiety and tying their happiness to this old blueprint, which dates back to our parents. We talk about the Norman Rockwell painting, shows like Leave It to Beaver, where it's about finding love as fast as you can, high school sweetheart sometimes, and then running toward the picket fence. And I've always said that the picket fence has splinters. How difficult it is to build a relationship, not knowing that, but at a young age, thinking that happy means the house, marriage, the 2.2 kids, and the matching BMWs.
Is the family part of that potentially what a lot of people want, but maybe it's the stress of competing with the Joneses, the house, the 2.5 cars, the 2.5 whatever. That's the part that I think really starts to get to be the interesting point in modern society. Whether we're all driven towards something innately, then we've got the competition of trying to have all this other stuff.
I might question whether or not we're actually driven towards that innately at all, to be honest. I think it's really hard to separate out what is innate and what is socialized. I think for us, when we talk about the American Nightmare, or one of the other titles in the book is Happily Ever After is bullshit. I think it's not to minimize the desire that many of us have, of course, to have family. That part I do believe is innate. Obviously, we're social creatures. The desire to procreate, all of these things are not things that are socialized. It's the quote unquote desire to have it look like, and this is where you're saying, this idea of competing with the Joneses, to have it look a certain way on the outside. I think that is actually the concept that we're speaking to, because it's not real. At the end of the day, the relationship doesn't start with the I do. The relationship starts after the I do. The hard work comes for most of us after you've made the commitment, not when you're walking down the aisle. And for so many of us, we don't ever see that part. Our movies, our books, stories we get from our parents and our families and society at large, they don't talk about Cinderella screaming at Prince Charming for the 25th time that week to pick up his socks. They just end at the I do's and the wedding, and she gets whisked away in the fancy carriage. And I think that is a lot of what we talk about in that way.
By the way, it's keeping up with the Joneses. And today it's the Kardashians. It's not competing with, it's keeping up with.
It's tough to compete with the youngest self-made billionaire in the world, or one of them at least. That's probably tough for most people. Let me keep it at some big picture moments just for a second. I think we can all think of our grandparents and stuff, and maybe most of our grandparents had it okay. Maybe they didn't. There seemed to be this, you mentioned the Norman Rockwell painting, this idealized vision of maybe we never really knew what was going on behind the scenes, but they kind of kept it together. They gave us our parents, they gave us, that kind of thing. This is one of the reasons, while I never expected to be in Saigon, Vietnam, it's one of the reasons as a Gen X guy who I think my generation at the forefront of when things really just started to shift and change. A dot-com kid, and then boom, here we are, the 2000s, the 2010s, the last 5 or 6 years, just utter chaos. But I would have to say, which was really fascinating for me, and I'm curious both of your perspectives, for me to randomly come to a traditional culture in Asia. Of course, ladies want to look fashionable, there's technology, the internet, all that kind of fun stuff. But it's quite different than America. It's quite different than America. And it reminds me so much of, let's say, my grandparents. And I've got a nephew in college right now, and I look at that situation contrasted, and I'm like, it's just a wild world right now. I mean, even for you both to give advice today, it's almost, there needs to be different advice for each generation, considering what's being thrown at them. It is so complicated, the topic that you've both jumped into.
Absolutely. And I'm like you, Michael. We grew up with pagers.
About the same age, yeah. Yeah, I had a pager.
I have one foot coming to America, late 70s, early 80s, parents Korean, old school, grew up in war, poverty. I mean, the idea of emotional intelligence for them, that's a luxury. They grew up making their own shoes. I grew up with no emotional milk. I grew up in America where being American meant Levi's and Coca-Cola. When it comes to love, finding the one and starting a family and all that. And I think the nightmare isn't family, because of course it's okay to want family. And if you want to get married young, great. The nightmare is the misconception of the perfect relationship or the happily ever after. It's the misconception that relationships are easy. When we get married young, especially in our 20s, and then if we're having kids, I don't know if we even have the capacity to build anything with legs. That's where it goes from the American dream to the American nightmare.
And Michael, I will say, to speak to the question you asked, or just the good point that you made, yeah, you're right. It's impossible, I think, for any one or even two authors or people to write about every generation's experience and every cultural experience. There's credit to be given to different ways of doing things. I'm sure you know this. You don't live here anymore, but you're from here. Americans like to think that everybody and everything should be like us. We tend to be a very self-centered nation. It's just how we're raised. There's collectivistic cultures versus individualistic cultures. There's different approaches to things, boundaries, relationships with family members. I mean, these are all cultural that we can't speak to every single classification because that wouldn't be fair. I will say, though, generationally, the younger generations, because the world has gotten smaller. My audience, I know specifically on TikTok, for example, is global and is a lot younger because TikTok tends to be. And the comments that I get from people who are in other countries, quite a few from Asian countries, are very similar than the comments I get even now from here. That could be a whole tangent we could go off on. It does make me question or wonder, now that the world has gotten smaller and we have access to information and seeing how people do things in different ways and mental health and all of these conversations we're having, it's changing, I think, globally. The expectation anyway, what we desire in relationships is changing.
Just to add to your thought, John, coming from Korea, one of my favorite things in terms of teasing ladies here in Vietnam, 20s, 30s, to call them grandmas. It's so entirely different, regardless of whether or not they might wear the latest yoga fashion and have the most pricey iPhone. In terms of the sensibilities, I respect where you're coming from, Vanessa, that you might see some feedback too. On the ground, inside a homogenous place like Vietnam, it is so radically different in terms of that tradition. And I think that's true across Asia to some extent. even if there's all kinds of late night partying and chaos and all that kind of stuff. Anyways, what I'm saying is this tradition versus America being, quote, more modern.
Can I ask you, what was the catalyst that brought you to Vietnam? Was it relationship related?
No, it was a random speaking gig that I spent 4 months in Asia. And then I was in 20 cities. And the place that I had the most fun was Saigon. So I stayed. But the biggest thing, though, that I do see in your work that I really like, at least when I think about myself, is the perfection part. And then the hard part is not only do I have to reflect on my own desire for perfection, but then if you're in a relationship, you have to think about, well, how is that other person thinking about perfection? The real rub, which is where I think both of you get to, is there's not a communication about that. Where if two people, maybe they're 6 months in or whatever, is the idea like, hey, if we might want this to work in the future, we both have to be reasonable. We both have to believe that there's going to be turbulence. There's going to be problems. And that conversation just doesn't happen early in relationships, at least in my experience.
What is advertised is locking eyes across the room, the hairs on the back of your neck go up, and the lightning in the bottle, finding the one, that whole thing. What's not talked about a lot are the differences. Vanessa and I are very different. We had a rocky beginning, everything from love languages to attachment styles. One of the things we talk about in the book is the overfunctioner and the underfunctioner. All these relationship dynamics, all these things that actually are part of the day-to-day that will build or break a relationship is not talked about. What's talked about is, how was the sex? Is he hot?
The chemistry component. And I think to your point, Michael, the really raw, real conversations around relationships are hard. Let's lay it out on the table and have some hard conversations up front rather than, I think a lot of people skirt around them. They want to stay in the honeymoon phase as long as possible. They think that fighting equals something's wrong. So they avoid fighting at all costs. A lot of these things end up just biting you in the ass later on because we're not getting to the real meat of having a long-term sustaining relationship, which is, to John's point, navigating differences and communication styles and fighting styles and all the important things that we talk about in the book.
But that honeymoon phase, if one hasn't had a decent amount of relationship failure, how does one really understand or know that the honeymoon phase is just a phase? I'm going to let you comment, John, also, because your background, divorce, really changing your life. I want to hear that story. But I think for myself, it's like, okay, if I saw your book 15 years ago, I'd be like, okay, whatever. Maybe I didn't have enough failure. But then with a certain amount of failure, then I see your book and I'm like, oh man, why didn't someone give me this book 15 years ago? It's a vicious circle. When you have the experience of failure, the message is much more easily accepted. If you don't have the failure experience, you might be like, whatever, they're just talking, bunch of therapists, whatever. It's not relevant to me.
To answer your question, how do you know? When you're younger, you're not supposed to know. I think the broken hearts, it's a rite of passage. I don't think you could go through this world without getting your heart broken. I think relationships expire. And I think that sets us off into a hero's journey. Through that journey, we grow, evolve, and then we make different choices. It's just part of life. This idea of avoiding heartbreak is not realistic. I don't think you do the best you can with what you have and you just go. The ante to sit at the table of love is always going to be possible heartbreak.
Speak to me about your divorce, John. I want to hear the story. What was the trigger and what went wrong? And I'm guessing that you had to go through that to be the person you are today, and you probably wouldn't give it back. You probably would say, well, I needed to go through that whole experience.
It was the single greatest catalyst to my rebirth or my repositioning, my rebuilding, my connecting back to me. Probably the hardest thing I've ever gone through. We got married young. I was 29. She was around 25 or 24. All we knew was the chemistry. All we knew was connection. And we didn't realize that there was enmeshment and codependency and our relationship dynamic was unhealthy. It just felt good because there was a lot of dopamine. It was young love. It was high school love. It was the kind of love where you lose yourself in someone else. And of course, that feels good and it's very romantic, but it doesn't have legs. It's not sustainable. The plane was meant to go down. Young and codependent, lost ourselves in each other, had no tools. I was a walking reaction. I was also miserable. One of my books is called I Used to Be a Miserable Fuck because I was very unhappy and chasing shiny things, hit pause on life, had no sense of self. All of that contributed to the marriage which is why it crumbled. But I think the biggest reason is I tell people I went from her mouth to her nipple, meaning I went from being her partner to more like her son. When that happens and the dynamic of the relationship changes, it's really hard to come back from that because it's like secondary change. It's almost like change that's irreversible, feelings change, chemistry changes. From there, it was just very fast. It was her saying, let's get a separation, me going on Craigslist, finding a roommate because I thought maybe for the first time I can give her something because she's asking for it and to not make it about me. And then 2 weeks later, the separation, of course, turned into a divorce. That was that. And I started with nothing, no money, no friends, just a blog called Being Your Therapist. And that was the beginning.
But that feeling at first, that feeling of, okay, it's over. You put all this time and energy, all this thinking into this other person. And now, even if you don't realize it at the moment, you're blank slate. But there is so much power, so much energy when people, whether it's by a situation like your situation or luck or random or whatever, but when you find that blank slate, a lot of amazing things can happen when you have the time to just sit back and go, whoa, okay, what have I been doing? What can I do? So many opportunities.
Or you could numb, hide, run. You go the other way.
We've all seen that in people.
Right.
Sure. Addictions, maybe using sex as a way to hide from intimacy. What you're talking about is there, and that's what I call the richest soil for growth is after an expired relationship. But it takes a while for the dust to settle, for you to start healing, for the pain to go away. Like the stages of grief, pain, shock, denial, jealousy, anger, all of that. But after that, on the other side of that, after the deep breath, and now what? Like you said, yeah, your life etch-a-sketch is completely shaken where you can start over. Then it tips into now empowerment. Who do I want to be now? What do I want to work on? That's when people start going to the gym, building things, and all of that amazing stuff.
Can I let either of you can choose in terms of a definition? I think it's important. I have an idea of a definition in my mind, but you've brought up the term codependency several times. I think it's worth explaining that to the audience in terms of your perspective, because I think that'll allow people to more easily relate to, oh, have I lived my life this way? How would you best give that definition?
I teach a series of courses on codependency. It's really like one of the flags that I wave. I became obsessed with understanding it as a concept when I was about 25 and I was in my own initial stages of therapy and I was in a relationship with somebody who was struggling with alcohol and I was putting all the pieces together and going to Al-Anon. And I'll tell you what, we've really come to this understanding. And a lot of people kind of raise their eyebrow when I say this, but I'm going to say from my clinical background and perspective, we're all codependent. Now, listen, I can only really speak to the Western perspective, but it's the air that we breathe. I think a lot of us have a misunderstanding when we hear the word codependency. It was really coined to be the term that talked about the wives of alcoholic husbands. That's really what we think about even now when we think of that word. But the way that I describe it is really just simply this. If you're good, I'm good. If you're not good, I'm not good. My emotional state is based on somebody else. My sense of worth and goodness is based outside of myself. It's based on somebody else. It's the air that we breathe, meaning society teaches us that love should be codependent. That's what real love should look like, sound like, feel like, smell like, taste like. We're set up to exist in relationships in a codependent way. There's a real paradigm shift, I guess, that we have to really have as a society if we want to start to have these healthier, more long-lasting relationships that John and I talk about, which really includes a more interdependent way of being in relationship with one another. We are two sovereign, autonomous beings who choose to do life with each other. I don't own him. He doesn't own me. He doesn't owe me anything. I don't owe him anything. We look at relationships very much like they're transactional. I've done this for you, so you should do this for me. Or because you love me, you should do X, Y, and Z. It's very transactional, and that's very codependent.
I love the way that you brought that up, that if I'm sad, you should be sad. Or if the other person's sad, I should be sad. That makes me reflect on my own life. Because generally, if you can think about somebody that just does a podcast for over 1,000 episodes and talks to everybody, I'm pretty excited every day that hits. The idea, for me, I think it's very difficult, the idea of people that might be in my life that become sad and sometimes you can see they want you to be sad too. And I'm like, hold on, I'm not sad.
And that's the thing. It's not just romantic relationships. It's any relationship. It's kind of like once a codependent, always a codependent. We all have codependent tendencies and they show up, I promise you, in every relationship. A lot of people are like, oh, I'm only codependent with this one person, but nobody else. And I'm always like, no, it just manifests differently. The behaviors might be different in different relationships, but it's usually just the way that we know how to relate to each other.
Let's speak to the lightning in the bottle. I want you to explain your exact perspective on it, but it does seem like so much of our relationships, really, it all comes down to that. And we will do so many crazy things for lightning in a bottle. We'll change our life. We'll do everything just for lightning in a bottle. And I've done it. And I look back on it. I'm like, hold on, you're a reasonable, rational guy. Why did you do that? What was wrong with you? It's fascinating what we will do in the pursuit of what generally, maybe you think it's love, but it's more infatuation at that early stage. But speak to the lightning in the bottle.
I think I wrote a blog about it, about when I first met my ex-wife. I saw angels, the doors open, there was a halo above her head, angels singing. I think sometimes the lightning in the bottle can be dysfunction. I think that if attraction is that animalistic, sure, it can be healthy, but there's also a high chance it may not be healthy. A lot of times we gravitate toward chaos or what we're used to based on our upbringing. No child enters adulthood unscarred. Maybe what smells familiar is what you mistake as chemistry. When I met Vanessa, yes, of course, there was some chemistry, right? Or we wouldn't be together. But there was a stretch of what's in the book, finding beauty in the contrast, looking at our differences. It was more like peeling an onion instead of biting into an apple. That's, I think, more sustainable.
You got to have patience for that, though. The modern age doesn't afford a lot of patience.
I think that's what's happening with the younger generation. A lot of people bailing, ghosting, leaving too soon because they are impatient and they are used to instant gratification. There is no instant gratification relationship. It's not like that. It's not like a one fits all or plug and play. It's a lot of introspection, a lot of looking at yourself, a lot of taking ownership, all the things that are so hard to do.
I have never used a dating app. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm not talking down to them. I'm sure quite a few people have found a great relationship on a Tinder or something like that. But I got to tell you, I watched that documentary. That was an eye-opener for me, The Tinder Swindler. Did you guys see this thing?
No,
but everybody's talked about it.
Just amazing to me because it's all fantasy. It's not real. Whereas, I mean, I love living in a big city. People will say, oh, I want to be in the countryside. Well, that's great. If you've got your significant other, that's fine. But if you're living in the countryside and you're looking to meet a lot of people to find someone you mesh with, what's not exactly going to happen out there with a 4-person city. You need to be able to talk to people. And I love that part about being in a city in the sense that you can talk to people. But I guess a lot of people these days, they think the apps are a substitution for the talking and meeting people because that can't go onto an app.
I always tell people that we've become baseball cards because of the toxic swipe culture.
And what has that led to? As a former baseball catcher, that's such a great analogy. It's frankly frightening when you say it.
It's led to false advertising and judgment. It's led to a false sense of what love and dating and relationships are like. It's led to dick pics and ghosting and filters. And then people being discouraged, hate and deleting their dating app and giving up on love. And then as humans, love is baked in. So then we also give it another try. We have a bad experience. What can be dangerous is turning it inward, or you're thinking that you're unlovable or unattractive.
Something's wrong with you.
Something's wrong with you. So yeah, a lot of that happening these days.
I love the expression love like it's going to end. Very stoic, right? Isn't the stoic perspective is to say, let me imagine the worst case scenario. I love that chapter title, Love Like It's Going to End. Explain what you mean.
I think that comes from my deep practice of mindfulness and Buddhist psychology and really just my deep work around getting still and how much that transformed my relationship to not only the world around me, but the people in my life and those that I loved. I was just having this conversation actually with a client the other day about how our culture, we have such a unhealthy relationship with death and dying, as seen by our perpetual seeking out youth forever. We all pretend like we're not going to die. We don't want to look at it. We don't want to hear it. We have a lot of euphemisms for death. We just don't look it in the face. We don't revere it the way that a lot of other cultures actually do. We don't talk to our kids about it, all these things. And it shows. It shows in how we love. This idea, love like it's going to end. I mean, one of the things that spurred that title was a really good friend of mine in grad school passed away pretty unexpectedly. Young, healthy guy was diagnosed with lung cancer, late stage, and was gone within a year or two. A girlfriend, a mutual friend of ours said, none of this is promised. And I remember that quote still when I say it out loud. I can feel it in my gut. It really makes you reconsider, how are you going to show up in every moment of every day? Because right now I could get hit by a bus. This is what happens. People go in an instant. Like if that happened to John, would I be able to say I loved him the best way that I could? I just don't think we think like that. And when you reframe the way you love, knowing and really sitting with and meditating on the reality that it's going to end, I think it can be a really powerful practice in challenging how you love and challenging the kind of quality of your love.
Kind of a couple points there just to add. Living in Southeast Asia for a decade, a Buddhist country, I think by the process of osmosis, even though I'm not really doing any study, but I'm surrounded by yoga teachers and been practicing yoga for 10 years, more of a hardcore exercise yoga these days, it seems like. But I love what it's done to me. Even if I can't necessarily define it, there's something that it just has done to me. And another point you made also about death, a friend of mine the other day, I was familiar with this concept, but she said to me they were celebrating her grandfather's death from 2 years ago, and they celebrate it every year. That's such a contrast to America. How many Americans celebrate the death of their parent or the death of their grandparent? They do not.
Yes, that's exactly it. Somebody passes away and then what happens? Of course we mourn. I mean, that doesn't go away, but there's no more celebration. It's just sadness. And that just feels like such a one-sided approach. You can't have joy without sadness. You can't have light without dark. So if we're not embracing the other 50% of the human relational, emotional experience, then we're only experiencing 50%.
I also feel like when relationships end, especially with divorce, because when you're divorced, people stamp defective on your head, or maybe we do it ourselves. But when someone says divorce, why don't we say congratulations?
Congratulations.
Or let's celebrate the fact that you were in something toxic or not growing. Usually here, I'm sorry. Are you okay?
It could possibly be a celebration for all that was. Maybe if you guys are amicable, especially, that's a celebration in and of itself. Like there's so many other ways to look at it.
The flip side could be that perhaps a couple bailed too early. It gets complicated to try and find exactly for each situation, but your point is well taken. I think one of the most interesting things for me, and you both can surely jump in, is that when leaving one relationship, regardless of how much time might pass before the next relationship, is allowing oneself to come into the new relationship and damn, this is hard, without the baggage of the prior one, meaning to come in fresh. Yes, you learn things, there's positive things, but not to assume that that new person is going to be like the prior person in some way. We're probably drawn to pattern matching when it might not necessarily be the best idea.
Love without your past is one of the chapters in our book. It's just all about that. It's coming to something fresh with new lenses, leaving old love experiences, patterns, blueprints, definitions in the past. And I think creating a new love experience is how you actually rewire yourself in your body. Many people don't do that. Instead, they repeat the old. Faces are changing, but that same relationship dynamic keeps happening. And this is why a lot of people say, oh, I keep dating the same person. It's because you're loving with your past. You're bringing in the old and not creating something new.
Yeah, I think for a lot of us, we don't stop to take the time in between relationships to really dissect and integrate what the lessons were. So many clients that come in and it's very blamey and it's very finger pointy and I'm the victim. And it's not to take away whatever pain and potential trauma people went through in relationships. It's not to minimize that. But even in those kind of relationships, there's still something that we can own. There's still something that we can learn. If we can get to a place of learning and integration, that's when we break those patterns. That's when we are able to actually leave that shit at the door and enter those new relationships fresh. Because if we don't do that, it's pretty inevitable that you're going to bring that baggage in.
As you both observe, let's just say modern America in the last 5 or 6, 7 years, is it fair to say that in the last 5 or 6, 7 years, and this is just my observation, the world of relationships, and if you add in the new debates and conflicts about gender, it sure seems like the world has gotten so complicated. I just can't imagine how young people, 16, 17, 18 years of age, they are facing an entirely different landscape than we faced. I truly feel sorry for them. I mean, it seems like in some ways, the older generations are kind of manipulating the landscape upon which these young people have to exist. It's terribly unfair because so much is being thrown at them that was never thrown at us.
The way I see it, is it that things are complicated or are people finally not hiding?
Yeah.
So whether we're
I agree.
talking about different types of relationships, like open relationships and poly and all that, or we're talking about gender roles, yeah, there's a lot of rocks being turned over. It's stirring up a lot in everyone. And I think it's not that it's complicated. I think people are finally listening to their own truth. It's shaking a lot of people's shoulds.
I was watching a report the other day about the population growth and where it's predicted to go in China in the next 20 or 30 years. I saw one gentleman saying that he expects the population to cut in half, which would be quite amazing. And China had the one-child policy for a long time. But with these scenarios that I bring up and that you had just expanded on, ultimately, it's an interesting thing in terms of children. That's really changing now. I mean, I grew up in an era where it seemed like most families was 3, 4, 5 kids. That's changed. And a lot of it's changed, which people are not really honest about it. The older generation, the boomers with all the money, are not necessarily honest about why the younger generation are not having kids. And a lot of it's economics.
You nailed it. And I hate to generalize, but a lot of the older generation, they don't want to admit also what their part was in the reality that now the younger generation can't afford to have 3, 4 kids, even if they wanted to, because this wasn't created by us. We were handed the world we were handed. I think you're spot on, Michael. I think it's economically driven. I also think it has to do with generationally, we do want to understand ourselves more. There is more of a drive and a desire to do this self-betterment work, go on these inner journeys, understand ourselves, unpack our trauma and our patterns and all of these things. And people are starting to realize that maybe I'm not ready to have a kid at 25. Maybe I should wait until I feel a little bit more prepared. Obviously, by nature, that means you're probably going to have less as far as number of children, especially women. Obviously, with women now, we have that ability to decide, and having children and getting married is not our only gateway to security and safety anymore. And now we're a couple generations into that reality. So we're choosing other things. We're choosing ourselves. And I've heard it called selfish. I've heard it called a lot of things. Listen, I'm speaking generally here, but I think right now the world's pretty populated. So I think we're okay if we've got a little bit of a dip here for a while, but maybe that's just me being positive thinking.
We got the 7.5 billion that a lot of people think that because the birth rates have dropped so low, the aggregate number right now doesn't really mean anything, but the rates drop so low that eventually the big number will come down. Let me bring up a minor made up case study and let you both play with it, so to speak. I imagine a couple, let's just go a typical traditional fight. The lady is expressing, could be the man, but in this case, it's the lady, is expressing some jealousy. The man is feeling like, hold on, there is nothing to be jealous about, but that doesn't solve anything. Both sides are kind of dug in. They're perhaps both blaming each other. There's not a lot of responsibility being taken. The fight is on, and this fight might go on for a long time until perhaps the participants in the fight eventually pull the ripcord and walk away from the relationship. And maybe if there was a way to communicate better, that moment, which may have not really been anything, could have been avoided.
Yes. Where is it coming from? In this case, jealousy. And what are you willing to own? I think the feeling of jealousy is normal as humans, but it's the behavior, whether it's controlling because of your own insecurity or fears, trying to grab the other person, trying to mold the other person.
Demanding.
That creates an unsafe space. That creates drift. It causes people to run. I think we all have a responsibility to explore our own feelings and where it comes from and then own that, process that.
How would you navigate a couple that's in the middle of something like that? Because it's going to be, I'm assuming, a little bit different advice for each side because they're each looking at it a little bit differently. One is feeling threatened. Hold on, I'm not doing anything. The other is thinking, hold on, you are doing something. You're walking the line over here.
If I were to look at it, say, for example, I had a couple like this in therapy, which we probably have had multiple examples of this. I think we start with softening into, so in this example, it's a woman, we soften into her relationship with jealousy, her relationship with being dismissed or feeling unsafe or somebody betraying her, for example. And there's potential there to go deeper because maybe betrayal actually wasn't her experience in her romantic relationships in the past. Maybe she was betrayed by, let's say, a parent. She has a very hot trigger point around any kind of spidey sense that might be coming up for her around betrayal. It activates her. It sends her into her emotional reactionary response, and she's not able to think logically anymore. If we slow that couple down and I can work with her in the presence of him, hopefully, to really get into the why, this is what John was speaking to around owning it and deepening into an intimate and a vulnerable place where she can relate and talk to him about what that brings up for her and the past experience it's pulling from. You're going to see then most likely the other partner soften out of their defense because they realize it's not personal. It's actually nothing to do with him. It's actually all about her. Usually what'll happen is that person will go, oh shit, it's not about me. And they can go, oh, wow, I'm so sorry that that's been your experience. And then suddenly there's a softening and then there's a conversation instead of a fight.
This is why you guys get paid the big bucks, because it's to break down something that for most people can seem like a tornado or hurricane, intractable. Oh my gosh, it's the end of the world. And you kind of just bring it down a notch. It's so difficult in the middle of the tornado, isn't it?
It's difficult to do it without a mediator because people fight unfair. If you're assassinating character or if you're not creating a safe space, the fights aren't productive. They could be toxic. They could be cracking that relationship container. This is why couples therapy is so important. Having someone who can create a space that's safe so people fight fair. Through that, there's a lot of revelations about self, the relationship, deeper connection. And then people realize, oh, it wasn't even about what was on the surface. It wasn't about you liking a model on Instagram or going out. It was about something deeper. Oh, it's tied to my own fears or what happened to me that created this kind of belief. Those revelations have to happen for people to have those aha moments and then do something about that. And those revelations can't happen if the space is unsafe, if people are throwing chairs and calling each other names.
John always says, one of the things that I've taken from him that I use even in our personal relationship is this idea that judgment and curiosity can't live in the same space. If you are doing your best to pull from curiosity when you're in a fight with, let's say, a partner, anybody really, but let's say a partner in this example, and it's intentional, it's a conscious choice, and it takes skill and muscle and building this muscle to continue to come back to being curious about that person's experience, about what's going on for them, about the feeling that's going on underneath what they're saying. And you continue to come back to curiosity. It really does something to you where it becomes really difficult to pull from judgment. And when we're in judgment, that's usually when the walls come up, the attacking language comes out and things like that. John has a really good saying that I've stolen and made it one of my mantras, which is try to understand before being understood. I'm not joking when I say that when John and I get into any kind of conflict, I repeat that on loop in my mind. I swear I'm paying attention to what he's saying, but also at the same time, I'm repeating this mantra over and over and over again because it's a reminder, helping me stay present in that moment and continuing to push me into curiosity instead of judgment.
Let me use an example. Monogamous heterosexual couple. You mentioned, John, you said the example was kind of a side tangent, liking the model on Instagram. Again, we're staying at a kind of a heterosexual monogamous couple. For a male, liking a model on Instagram, I don't see what the benefit is there. I can only see downside. I can't see any benefit. On the flip side, if the lady in the relationship, if she likes another guy or something on Instagram, I can't see any upside there too. It just seems like these apps are designed to lead us to conflict. Am I crazy?
Vanessa and I did this Instagram live once, and we said that it's normal to fantasize about others, and it was a shitstorm. We weren't saying that you should intentionally fantasize about someone else while you're making love to your partner, but we were just saying as humans, you're going to find someone else attractive. And if you think that your partner doesn't find someone attractive,
you're lying to yourself.
You're just lying to yourselves. But it also doesn't mean that he or she wants to build a relationship with someone. You're going to run into someone at Starbucks or an old friend or something. You're going to have some kind of connection. That's just being human in this world. Whether you're liking photos on Instagram, which to me, it's all about intention. If you're liking these photos to start a conversation,
sliding into their DMs.
Yeah, or trying to do something with that intention, that's very different than noticing someone or having a conversation with someone and then finding yourself saying, oh, that person is attractive.
I'm kind of like giggling to myself over here because I'm thinking about, I guess, even just one generation ago when we didn't have all these apps and all this stuff at our fingertips. When I think about the number of people who I knew who knew their dads had stacks of Playboys, whether they had seen them directly or whether they just knew of their presence and they knew they had them in the house and it was normal and common for this to be a thing. So I guess my question is like, why is that any different?
That's really true. And I remember the stacks. There was no internet. We saw the stacks.
Yes, we all saw the stacks, like whether it was at friends, dads' houses, whatever. And it's like, why is that any different? I'm one of those maybe anomalies of a woman where I'm very not jealous and things don't really ruffle my feathers that way. But it just feels like we're looking at this. I get it. There's accessibility. They're at your fingertips. It's a real person that you can maybe slide into their DMs. So there's maybe something about that layer.
There's more threat.
That's different.
Yeah,
right.
With liking someone on Instagram, a photo.
Then looking through a magazine.
Yeah. And, when you're looking at a magazine, there's distance because that is someone in a magazine who you're probably not going to be able to engage with.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
On Instagram, there is no wall. You can engage with these people. It could be your neighbor.
I'll offer one that has happened to me in the last 10 years. You're probably going to guess, well, gosh, Mike, we can understand why maybe you stayed. Currently, by World Health Organization metrics, the most obese countries in the world are a couple South Pacific islands, and then the leader is America. The least obese country in the world is Vietnam. And it is a country, of course, it's very hot. It's a country where there's a lot of competition amongst ladies. I'm not sure if it's necessarily a competition with each other or they just kind of like to look good. There are a lot of skirts and there are a lot of heels. There's a lot of thin people. It's literally impossible. If you're in the center of the city and you're near an office building or you're near a mall, it's literally impossible as a male for me to walk around and not notice beauty. Of course, I'm never going to talk to most people. Maybe it's the only time I ever see them in my life. But this gets back to your fantasizing part, which, yeah, it's human. I mean, how can you not notice if you walk by someone? If I was a woman, I would notice another woman looked really nice. And I think that's something that's difficult in many relationships, but it is a truism about us, is that we might be engaged in happily in love in one relationship, but you might walk through the mall and you still might be like, oh my gosh, wow, I don't want to look over there anymore,
Yeah, I think this goes back to that idea of relationships being transactional. Because we're in a relationship, you owe me this. Somehow you don't get to ever look at another person. You don't get to fantasize about somebody. Like, you owe me that. And if you do that, then you're somehow personally offending or attacking me. We put so much personalization on this stuff when really it's not about that. It's like human animal. It feels very much like that. There's some kind of ownership in that relationship where there's like, you shouldn't be doing this because you're mine.
The book, It's Not Me, It's You, Break the Blame Cycle, Relationship Better. John, Vanessa, very cool stuff. We could easily go for hours and hours and probably would get even more deep into this topic. I only skimmed the surface for where you go. But look, in my world, I've written 7 investment books. And okay, a lot of people out there are trying to chase the gold ring. They want all the freedom. They want all the money. Well, when you get all that, what are you going to do with it? Well, you're going to try and find a relationship where you're going to hopefully want a relationship. And I would give you both credit. You dive into subjects that are difficult for people. And I think you give a fresh perspective. You give a perspective that's kind of common sense when you break it down to this level. Congrats for that. People will definitely have to check out the book.
Thank you, Mike, for having us. Our desire for this book, I suppose, was twofold. One, it was to pull the curtain back on being therapists. I think people have this misconception maybe that therapists have their shit together, which we're always out here to prove that that's not the case. We struggle, we're human too. But also it feels a lot like, here's the cliff notes of all of the shit that we see in our work with couples and also in our own relationships. And you can only cram so much into one book. And you're right, we could go for hours and hours and go deeper and deeper. But this is, hey, here's the biggest list that we could come up with of all these issues that if we really have even just a basic understanding of them, we really do believe that people can relationship better.
It's a toolkit. No one gives these tools out when you're 16 or 25 or whatever.
Yeah, we should be learning about this in high school and college. But instead, we're learning geometry and algebra, which we never use.
Hey, is there a website you guys want to direct people to? Is there any place we'd want to send people to?
Just go to our social media and you can click on our bio links. I'm at The Angry Therapist.
And I'm Vanessa S. Bennett. And then, yeah, you can order the book on Amazon. I mean, it's wide, any of your retailers as well. It's everywhere.
And Michael, thank you for having us on your show and creating this conversation. And anyone listening, if this stirs something in you, and because of that, go on a journey of ownership or looking inward, then that's the goal.
That's the goal for us. Yeah.
Thank you both. I appreciate it.
All right. Be well.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.